Aloha from Hana Kako. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Palakiko Changa IV, and I am a first-year law student and Ulu Lehua Scholar at the William S. Richardson School of Law. On behalf of the Ulu Lehua Scholars Program, which provides opportunities for students to serve the community, and the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special event titled Confronting the Climate Crisis, Community Building and Resilience. Today, over 193 countries celebrate Earth Day, an annual reminder of the beauty and fragility of our island home. But we don't need an Earth Day to see the significant changes that are occurring to our coastlines and our forests. We can hear from our brothers and sisters across the Pacific and indeed the world who are on the front lines of the struggle with this climate crisis. Today, we get to talk about this important issue and the role we all can play in making change. We have a great panel lined up for you today. All three panelists are no strangers to this conversation of justice, peace, and community building in our changing environment. Our first panelist is Richardson Law School professor Maxine Burkett. Professor Burkett is a co-founder and senior advisor of the Institute for Climate and Peace and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is a well-respected international expert in the law and policy of climate change, with a specific focus on climate justice, climate-induced migration, and climate change, peace, and conflict. Professor Burkett received her BA from Williams College, which awarded her the Bicentennial Medal for Distinguished Achievement in 2016. She also attended Exeter College, Oxford University, and received her JD from Berkeley Law, University of California. Our next panelist is Dr. Kealoha Fox, who is a Kanaka Maoli scientist, advocate, and advisor to the Institute for Climate and Peace. Dr. Fox has published numerous books, articles, and editorials applying indigenous innovation for collaborative solutions in science, practice, and policy. She is a former State of Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commissioner and Hawaii Greenhouse Gas Sequestration Task Force member. Kealoha has been deeply trained by esteemed community elders in traditional practices and serves on the National Congress of American Indian Climate Action Task Force, OEV Climate Collective, and the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander COVID-19 Response, Recovery, and Resilience team. Dr. Maya Sotoro is our third panelist, who is a consultant to the Obama Foundation, where she works closely with their international team to develop programming in the Pacific Asia region. Prior to her work with the Obama Foundation, she was the director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a recognized expert in multicultural education, social studies methods, and peace education. Dr. Soetoro is a co-founder and senior advisor of the Institute for Climate and Peace, and also a co-founder of the nonprofit Seeds for Peace, which creates peace-building action plan workshops for educators, families, and community leaders. She was awarded a master's degree in secondary education from NYU's College of Education and a PhD in multicultural education from the University of Hawaii. Our panel will be ably moderated by program specialist and extraordinary member of the Judiciary History Center's team, Brianna Gouveia. I hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Brianna and our esteemed panelists.
Mahalo, Palakiko. Thank you so much for that introduction. Just some quick housekeeping before we get into our discussion. I do want to remind everyone that we are recording this and it will be up on our YouTube channel afterwards. And at the end of our discussion, we do have some time to take, well, we should have some time to take some questions. So please use the Q&A, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. All right. So before we get into the deep topics for this discussion, I do want to say Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you for being with us, and especially to Maya, Maxine, and Kealoha. And so to get us started, Maxine, would you mind taking us through a little bit about ICP and your work there and your mission?
Yes, happy to. Aloha, everyone. It's really wonderful to be a part of this conversation. Happy Earth Day every day. I am so honored to be on this panel with dear friends and colleagues, Maya and Kealoha, to talk about the work that we're doing at ICP, but just to talk about these issues generally and their relevance to our communities, our families, our region. we at the Institute for Climate and Peace came together. It was a conversation that I was having with Maya to talk about the climate crisis and talk about the climate crisis in a way that it hasn't been generally talked about, which is to say we usually think about the science of climate change and we think about the economics of shifting our economy away from fossil fuels, but we weren't talking about people. We weren't talking about, say, adaptation in the context of social cohesion. We weren't necessarily talking to each other about what it means to understand this as a crisis of conflict fundamentally, rather than one just of sort of, again, the science of pollution and its impacts. So together we were thinking about how we can address these major absences, but really critical parts of our surviving and thriving over the next years, decades, and generations. So the Institute for Climate and Peace, our mission is to advance peaceful, climate resilient futures by harnessing the inherent wisdom, power, ingenuity, and voices of the communities that we serve. And what that means on the ground is trying to build the key components of positive peace. And I'll leave a lot of that to Maya to tease out. But a lot of that really resonated for me as someone who does climate justice, right? Understanding what some of the root issues are and the disproportionate impact of those changes to communities that have often been in the front lines of the greatest environmental burdens. ICP is seeking to address that at the individual and community level on up throughout our region.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Kealoha?
Aloha mai kako. I'm Kealoha Fox, and I'm happy to be zooming in from the Aina and Vai of Hawaii. I actually wanted to first just start by honoring and acknowledging King Kamehameha V, who we refer to as Ali'iolani, the grandson of King Kamehameha I and King of the Hawaiian Islands. I think it's really important for us to just ground and start the conversation. And as I share about me and my role, starting with his motto of Onipa'a. And what does it mean to be brave and firm and steadfast and determined in the work that you do? And how do you bring diligence to that work so that others can join you and that we have that collective abundance and we have that collective change? And that's part of the work that I do with the Institute for Climate and Peace with both Maxine and Maya, where I serve as an advisor. I think it's really important as I reflect on my past few years of work to also really tie it to the present day, the past, and then also the future, right? So when we think about the Piko of the place that we're talking about and the Piko of the person who helped to found the historical center, all of that is so connected to the work that we're doing at ICP, and it's part of the genealogy and the mo'olelo that we hope to craft and to navigate for the future. And so I'm really looking forward and excited for the conversation today. ICP being grounded, founded, and born in Hawaii, I think brings an important part to the conversation today for Earth Day. So mahalo.
Mahalo, Kealoha. Maya.
Mahalo, Brianna and Palakiko and Maxine and Kealoha. Thank you for so beautifully introducing ICP. Before I speak about ICP in terms of its vision of positive peace building, I would like to introduce this new Women and Climate video for Earth Day. We are one of 25 partners committed to the critical importance of gender equity and climate action. And ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab for their, they have kindly contributed this video and its upcoming series on the UN SDG 13 climate action for us to consider at the start of this discussion. So with that, I'll ask you to please share the video. And mahalo nui, thank you so much for having us here.
Climate change is an increasingly urgent threat multiplier, exacerbating inequalities, spurring conflict, political instability, and increasing displacement. Women bear the brunt of climate change and its impact on physical health, livelihoods, food insecurity, and gender-based violence. United Nations agencies, the World Economic Forum, the Interparliamentary Union, and civil society have all urgently called for gender-responsive action to the climate crisis. We cannot avert climate-induced catastrophe or meet climate goals without women. In fact, women have been at the forefront of climate change since Eunice Newton-Foote was the first scientist to discover the link between increased CO2 in the atmosphere and planetary warming, way back in 1856. Indigenous women continue to brave the front lines of protest against fossil fuel extraction. Young women and girls lead by example and have galvanized millions around the world through Fridays for Future's school strikes, community groups, and activism to draw attention to the rapidly worsening climate crisis. Women are on the front lines of climate solutions too, inventing and sharing new technologies, deploying indigenous and regenerative agricultural practices, building zero waste and circular economy business models, managing renewable energy, and water and forest conservation actions as entrepreneurs and women's groups. As Melinda Gates says, women are not just victims of a broken world, they can be architects of a better one. This is why we need gender-responsive climate action. There's a global framework already in place. At COP25 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, held in 2019, parties agreed on a 5-year Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender and its Gender Action Plan. It aims to enhance women's leadership in climate negotiations and to mainstream gender equality in climate policies and actions. The latest research shows more women in positions of power correlates with more attention to sustainability and climate issues. But in both national delegations and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change bodies, women are still significantly underrepresented in decision-making. So what more can parliamentarians do? First, advocate, support implementation of the Lima Gender Action Plan, and call on your country to integrate gender equality into national climate policies. Second, educate. Support intersectional climate education for both schools and your parliamentary colleagues. Third, promote. Call for women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in climate leadership at all levels. And finally, act. Be a role model by starting or joining a parliamentary working group to promote gender-responsive climate action and green COVID-19 response.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We are in the middle of a climate summit and all of us are paying attention. We'll hear more about that, no doubt. But this video speaks to the fact that we are concerned with climate justice that is inclusive, it's intersectional. It pays attention to the wisdom of frontline communities and individuals and the solutions and mandates born from their stories. So we need to think about the voices and wisdom of women, their activism, and of indigenous youth and other folks who are in the most vulnerable spaces, island people, Pacifica people, other people of color and frontline communities whose livelihoods in the global south are being impacted, their ability to go to school is being impacted. And we know that their voices must be part of the solution, the strength of the solutions that come from these spaces, the love of land, the depth of understanding that they possess can make us feel empowered, and that's where our hope can lie. And so the climate movement as we see it is becoming more diverse, but we need to really ensure that every voice is interwoven into the climate crisis, and that we are engaging as climate communicators in building peace in ways that cast the net widely. Building peace is never straightforward, but it is, of course, extremely challenging in places where climate change is amplifying social and political instability. Climate change is a threat multiplier, Maxine has taught me, and it exacerbates and prolongs violent conflict through resource scarcity, through displacement, through loss. It increases the human costs of war, but the converse is also true, which is that if peace building is present, if you have collaboration and shared economies and community mapping and community source solutions and compassion and communication between neighbors and so on, we are much more resilient and can face the climate crisis head on. So we really believe that climate justice requires this positive peace, not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of all of us. Not everyone can do carbon extraction, but those who can't can contribute to building schools or fish ponds. They can make decisions as consumers. They can educate others. They can engage in movement building. They can influence organizational cultures. They can lean on the levers of policy, reconnect with nature to help children fall in love with the earth so that they are loath to destroy it. They can create platforms for frontline communities who have not been heard. So it's a participatory vision where we start a podcast, we push for protections, and we engage in community organization so that we are building the world that we want to live in actively and together.
Thank you, Maya. And it's a beautiful vision that ICP has and the work that you are doing. So I really am grateful to have you to share your mana'a with us today. And I also just want to say that was a really powerful little clip that we just shared. And I definitely appreciate the angle of the looking through the lens of women, the impact on women, because so often the climate crisis is framed as such a large event, and it's nice to see that intersectional, nuanced angle of it. So thank you for sharing. And on that note, you threw out so many big, heavy topics there in your intro, but before we get into the depth of that, I do want to ask Maxine if she can just give us the foundation of what is it when we mean climate crisis, and what exactly of all of the environmental issues that we hear in the media, what more so are we affected by in our Pacific community?
Great. Yeah, that's right. It's probably very important for us to sort of define our terms at the outset. And I will say, and I'll use my mic because I recognize there may be a little bit of a volume issue here. I will say the climate crisis, which was formerly global warming, formerly climate change, in terms of our more informal discussion, or the labels that we've given to the phenomenon that we're seeing, the climate crisis is really, the use of the term crisis is underscoring the fact that we've known for decades now that our the sort of atmospheric chemistry is changing, and it's changing in such a way that it's making the average global temperature much warmer, with variable impacts across the globe, and felt very differently locally. The best way to think about it is that we have the same, the sun is doing the same thing it's always done. Our planet, though, has a much thicker blanket that we're trapped under, and that blanket is thickening because of of the sort of byproducts of our industrial societies, of land use changes, agricultural decisions, the sort of the things that make our global political economy as it is today hum at the speed with which it's moving. And so what we see as impacts will vary. And I'll talk about the local, more so the sort of local impacts, but the broad sweep of it is that we're seeing more extremes, right? So it could be extremes in temperature. So it's been, everything from a cold winter. Hawaii's been colder than I remember it in the last 20 years, but it's also much hotter. And what we see is that it's getting much hotter over time as well, year over year. So we're seeing the extremes in heat, the extremes in temperature generally. We're seeing extremes in precipitation. So we'll have these dry spells, droughts, riverbeds drying in in ways that we haven't seen historically, but then also rain bombs and heavy precipitation, flooding events. We're seeing the more threats of hurricanes as the sort of the temperatures warm across the Pacific, and that hurricane band, the sort of conveyor belt of hurricanes, that belt moves up and is starting to encompass the islands more frequently. And so as we see that those changes occurring, sea level rise as well, we have this sort of sense that something is different. And now, certainly in the past few years, every day seems a little bit different. And it starts to feel like something you can't put your finger on. Those are sort of the slow onset events, but then the sudden events are the things that we know as the rain bombs, the hurricane threats, the temperature increases and heat waves that we're seeing as well. So those are some of the impacts that I will sort of summarize for us locally.
Thank you, Maxine. Kealoha, I want to invite you to speak as well about some of the issues with climate migration and more direct impact on women and indigenous peoples, particularly in the Pacific.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to first kind of start with the data and the research that we've been conducting at ICP that shows that communities that are most under-resourced and overburdened are really the most vulnerable to these ongoing shocks and stressors that Maxine just really beautifully laid out for us. She gave us tangible examples that all of us are seeing at home in our communities where we work, where we go to school now year after year. Right. And in Hawaii, we really see this, full climate of dynamic oppressors when it comes to addressing representation and voice, consensus, and decision making for all people. And so that's especially important when we're talking about Kanaka Maoli and Native Hawaiians, immigrants, people of color, women, residents who are surviving on a low income and limited wages without benefits, and people who are becoming, at risk of houselessness, right? So at ICP, what we're doing is really taking the context and the content of all of these intersectional areas and these topics that matter to us. This is what we talk to our friends about, and this is what we do every day really in our professional and personal roles. It's part of the work that we do to volunteer in our communities and on our children's schools, right? We're trying to operationalize that in a unique way that no other institute at present is really putting a tangible voice to. And so we're hoping to be part of that leo and to elevate voices like ours so that we have a shared common goal that cultivates meaning, lasting engagements, and develops partnerships in communities across Hawaii, but also the entire Asia Pacific region, so we can come together and we have tangible near and long-term solutions that articulate all of our concerns across these areas and are able to create action plans for change. And I hope, we hope at ICP that we really do galvanize support and actions around what this Earth Day theme is this year, and how do we restore our Earth, and who do we do that with, and representation, voice, consensus, and decision-making around climate migration, women and gender inclusion, and indigenous populations is incredibly powerful for us to shed light on and amplify in the work that we do.
Thank you, Kealoha. Maya or Maxine, do you have anything to add? I have a follow-up question to you, Kealoha. Specifically, in this work that you're doing with communities across, Hawaii, the Pacific, and Asia, how are you seeing particularly indigenous communities take the lead against climate change?
We fundamentally believe that Hawaii's natural and cultural resources have a right to be protected. And also so do the people in the communities of this place, and that we want to help be a part of building a resistance to economic, environmental, and negative social impacts that the climate crisis is already bringing. So we always start with the foundation and the values of this place and our island's unique Aina Aloha that deeply motivates the work that we do. when I think about Kanaka Maoli and indigenous peoples around the world, we know that we're inherently and genealogically tied to the Aina, the Kai, the Mauna, the water, right? All of this is a part of our identity. This is at the core of what health and well-being means for us. And when we think of thriving, we're not just thinking of ourselves, we're also thinking about the community and the natural resources that surround us. And so that's important when we talk about ways in which we're leading climate action to address the climate crisis. And I think it goes back to where I started in the beginning of talking about King Kamehameha V and his lesson of Onipa'a. I'm also, really drawn and motivated at all times by looking at the past and how that articulates a clear common purpose and action plan for the present, right? So many people maybe don't know about his legacy as a monarch, but in 1868 to 1869, he made a clear driven purpose that when there were earthquakes, a volcanic eruption, and a deadly tsunami in the same year, at the same time, he ensured that all of his people had access to clothing, they had a place to live, which also included housing them with his own relatives, and that they had food to eat. And if we're talking about 1868 and 1869 in the context of 2021, I don't think much has actually shifted in the needs, but our values still really remain the same. And so I'm really driven and motivated by that. And I hope that we can kind of weave in that legacy and the spirit of who we come from as a people, as Kanaka Maoli and Native Hawaiians. And we can also think about very technical based solutions. And so some of the work that I've done has included policy and legislative and regulatory changes that ensures our land and natural environmental resources are prioritized in the state legislature, by the county councils, and by the federal governments, and by extension, their agencies and departments too. And there's some great resources that I would love to share later if we have some time.
Thank you, Kealoha, and thank you so much for sharing that history. It's really, really great to connect the past to present. It's, chapters written, lessons to look back on. And Maxine, I'd actually like to ask you a follow-up question since Kealoha mentioned leadership. How then, looking at Hawaii's leaders today, do you think that they can support all people in frontline communities with all of the issues surrounding climate change impacting them? How can Hawaii's leaders follow in the example of those before them?
Well, I mean, I think that telling those stories is critically important, and that's why Kealoha providing that context is so critically important. Again, for us to be thinking about what leadership and preparedness and vibrancy and resiliency looks like, and have that sort of embedded in the ethos of our leadership, right, and of our lawmaking as a result. So the first thing I was thinking of is, how about that minimum wage? What do we think about resilience with respect to public health and mental health? How will all of those things help us to be more resilient in the face of crises, acute and ongoing? And just to sort of circle back to the data, what we know is that the societies that are most successful at positive peace, they have a markedly better outcome when hit with disasters. If lower positive peace communities are 13 times more likely to suffer casualties as a result of a disaster, and there's a continuing information about the data there. And so what it means is not just that we are sort of green, right, in this conventional sense, but all of those key parts of having a healthy society are really tended to. And that's why that example that Kealoha just provided is a perfect example for us thinking about the contemporary parallels there, right, in terms of whether or not we're housing our neighbors, and whether or not we are providing a livable wage, and whether or not we are providing public health, mental health services. There are a number of things to think about with respect to specific plans. Obviously, we need to be moving aggressively, and it's cheaper and more efficient for us to move quickly to decarbonizing our local economy. We are exporting, billions of dollars each year to countries that are not known for positive peace, Libya and Russia, and countries that we're getting our super tanker of oil from. That becomes really important in thinking about where that money is going, and the fact that we're actually giving that away when we could be using it locally. So thinking about those solutions. I want to also underscore that part of what makes this crisis a crisis is that we've waited a long time, but we also haven't appreciated that it's not just a crisis of energy sources, but the other kinds of threats that have been borne historically by communities of color, by indigenous peoples, by Black communities. And those threats themselves have produced this cycle of consumption, overconsumption at the cost of others. So when we're thinking about our solutions, it's important to understand the source of the problem, because as we think about, say, this is a technological problem, we'll see the full sweep of it, but we'll also understand that in executing on those technologies, we can continue to have frontline communities suffer more. We can have, large footprints for renewable energy in indigenous communities and Pacific Islander communities. We can continue to have the waste product of that be in communities of color, of the frontline communities. We can extract those the core minerals or materials from communities of color, indigenous communities across the globe. And so we need to be thinking pretty holistically about sort of the full life cycle of our solution sets, and thinking beyond just what we consider traditionally a sort of technology or science-based response.
Thank you, Maxine. And actually, I'd like to circle back to Kealoha for a minute. You did mention in response earlier, you said, you mentioned how the Native Hawaiian framework, Aloha Aina, really encapsulates an intimate connection to land that for time has produced a positive reciprocal relationship between the land and people, and thriving community interaction there. And so actually it makes me think what Maxine was just saying. Kealoha, could you break down that framework a little bit more? What does a sustainable solution for some aspects of this climate crisis, what does it look like through that traditional Hawaiian framework? And can we, what examples can we look to today going on in our community that serve as great models for that? Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm always really motivated to share that I live in what is formerly occupied as a monocropped plantation, right? And so I look right outside my window right now, and I always go back to traditional Hawaiian agricultural and aquacultural technologies and the ways in which native and endemic plants have always been a source of cultural resource, but they've also been key to environmental sustainability and sustainable resource management opportunities, right? And so that's something that I always like to go back and look at. So when we're talking about fish ponds in cultivated gardens and irrigated terraces, this is something that's also not unique only to Hawaii. My genealogy here in Hawaii as a Kanaka Maoli is also intrinsically linked to Maya's genealogy in Indonesia and Maxine's genealogy in Jamaica. And we're island-based women. That's where our mo'okuauhau come from. And these traditional technologies have a tremendous role to play in present day that now Western science is only recently catching up to. And so that's been a part of my work within the past decade, is ensuring that we have a role and a place to ensure, where we need to start to bend policy and regulations to ensure that there's a place, right? And so that's something that I've been able to do, was able to work with a team. And so we changed the Hawaii Public Procurement Code so that Hawaiian and native plants could be a part of public procurement in public spaces again. And people don't fundamentally think that that's, always, when they hear about this idea, they don't necessarily think that's not going to change the climate crisis. But every day when you walk and you see trees that are flown in comparison to trees that are endemic and are native to Hawaii and our canoe crops, there's a real difference in the way we ideologically view a solution that either we import in to a place or something that we build from the ground up that was always here and meant to thrive for a place-based recommendation or intervention. And so I just wanted to give that as a brief, way that we can associate some of these topics with some of the wisdom that is still here and still exists in all of the communities and all of the islands that the three of us represent for our people and our culture and our values today.
Thank you, Kealoha. You mentioning the changes that the islands went through during the plantation period, it makes me think about how the climate crisis today is warping many habitats, many environments, the loss of biodiversity. We're seeing the rising sea levels causing people to have to move from their homes, the desertification, losing farmland. And with that, I'd actually like to pivot and ask Maya, something I think that doesn't get talked about so much in the media is this sense of grief and mourning for the change that the land goes through and also the impact on the community. So Maya, would you mind speaking about how climate grief and mourning factors into this?
Yes, absolutely. And as Kealoha and Maxine and you have ably pointed out, the climate crisis is not an isolated crisis, but it is deeply connected to systems of extraction, exploitation, accumulation through dispossession, and white supremacy or other kinds of meanness. And so it's traumatizing. And climate grief is very real, and it makes a lot of sense. And we have to address it, however, because if we allow it to overtake us, it puts us in a place of fight, flight, or freeze. And it very often does not enable us to really move forward in ways that are productive. We have to understand that grief, and the sacred opportunities for mourning are present and important. And we have to consider trauma and healing of ecosystem, individual, community, and relationship. And we're all a bit traumatized these days and have been for some time. And with the loss of livelihood and the food scarcity and toxic stress, we really have to fully acknowledge the loss in order to heal and nurture with great tenderness. We have to mourn the hunger in order to strengthen the resilience of food systems and improve short and long-term food security. We have to mourn the loss of livelihood for those who have had to go without before we can successfully build those circular and shared and indigenous economies. We have to mourn the oppression and bigotry in our communities before we can apply that strength-based approach and feel like we can contribute our gifts in pursuit of justice in our communities and schools. So we have, we have to be an intimate relationship with that grief, even though we have to also find the courage to lift our voices and have that holistic approach to healing through, as Maxine Kealoha mentioned, mental health, education, child welfare, disaster, first responders, other service providers. We have to look at all of the solutions in a multifaceted communal way and see the experience of children and adolescents and their sense of fear, to look at the stories of survivors. We can have an embodied social justice approach, I think, using movement and breath. And here in Hawaii Ha, there is so important in this somatic healing of both nature and our own bodies. We need to find the vocabulary as part of the healing from trauma and mourning, to say how we feel conflicted and ashamed and frustrated and disconnected and lonely. And we have to consider, I think, the depth of collaboration that is needed, and the storytelling that we can use here in Hawaii. We're auntie and uncle and cousin, and what does that mean to be in family, and how can we tell each other stories? And, and we have to acknowledge that the grief may be undulating, and it makes so much sense because we are in so much trouble. So we just, to avoid fatalism, we need to create narratives of resilience that demonstrate the ways in which we love each other and are connected, and are finding windows of opportunity, and are turning political corners in spite of how difficult it is. It's going to take an enormous sum of energy, resources, and action for the movement and momentum of climate change today to bear fruit. And as was said before, that means that we have to fight poverty and hold corporations accountable and be inclusive and build better balance and be minimalist and all of that. And that requires that we find also a way to move through the grief and the storm into joy, and to honor each other and our collective vision for a regenerative and beautiful future.
Thank you, Maya. That was beautiful. I do want to bring the elephant in the room into this conversation, that being the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is the second Earth Day, where we are, in post-COVID, still in it, really. And science tells us that with more environmental extremes, we will see a rise of pandemics as we don't get things under control. And obviously, health, as you've mentioned, is a huge element of the climate crisis, getting access to different communities. And I'm curious what your organization has seen, what challenges or new opportunities have been brought on through COVID-19, through the pandemic, as far as trying to implement that on the ground peace building, community connection. Yeah, so I'm very curious what your experience is with that.
So did you want me to answer, or Kealoha, Maxine?
Maya, you can definitely take this, or if, anyone.
Yeah, I'll start and you guys can add. I mean, I definitely think that we have experienced a lot of challenges that are related, connected. The challenge of isolation, right? A lot of these solutions require being in loving community, as I just mentioned. And a lot of these community source solutions require trust and time. And we haven't been able to give each other that time. And so that has been a challenge. There's been the challenge of not knowing what the future will bring. There's so many uncertainties. And so we need to approach that with a sense of navigational leadership, with a vision and gaze to the horizon, and a sense of creative exploration and courage to determine to see what's possible. And another metaphor that I think about is that we have the challenge of fear, the fear of letting go, right? So letting go of doing things the way they've always been doing. I think it's been there, we've had to let go of so much during this time, right? And so I believe that the climate crisis requires that we think about limiting waste and minimalism, as I mentioned. We see that tourism, the way it's been done, isn't healthy or sustainable or fair. So we have to let go of making a living the way that we've made a living. And I think it's really challenging to let go. And so that's a big challenge. And then of course, the grief that we mentioned, you know, we have to think about getting unstuck is another metaphor, right? There, I think when we look to the future, with that navigational leadership perspective, we have to, we see that, look, there's the status quo is an option. There's collapse, right? There's disciplined or controlled change. And then there's transformation where new norms are created. And really, there's only one choice there, you know, and that's that transformation. So this is a time when we have to courageously embrace that. And that means we have to, on the continent and elsewhere, challenge the rugged individualism that has been held up for so long. You know, we can love the freedom of expression and possibility that is inherent in some of that, but also recognize that here in Hawaii, you know, the Hawaii, the Kanaka, the Pacifica, the Asian cultures all value communal identity, and that can help us recognize our interconnectedness and let go of some of that, and remember that love is compatible with critique, and dissent is part of loyalty and knowledge and, you know, the civic engagement. And so as we move through this time of transition, what Valerie Carr has, I've noticed on more than one occasion, you know, called the darkness of the womb, not the tomb, right? And as we are laboring through this time, we really have to, I think, learn to transform in ways that are profoundly uncomfortable, but ultimately will bring us closer and enable us to feel and express the full, you know, revolutionary love that is needed to face this crisis.
Thank you, Maya.
Can I just,
Maxine?
yeah,
Yes,
I just wanted to quickly chime in just to
definitely.
say a couple of quick additional things to sort of follow up on what Maya has shared. And, you know, there have been a lot of, certainly early in the crisis and the pandemic, there had been sort of comparisons drawn between the need to limit our impact, which is, it's true on the individual level. The unfortunate side of that was that it sort of suggested that to get to where we needed to go in terms of reducing emissions, we had to live in this sort of deep isolation and severe austerity. And it's not a particularly beautiful picture to think we need multiple pandemics to see our sort of the arc of our emissions go down. I don't think that that's what's needed. I think what we're going to have to really emphasize is that there are different ways in which systemic strength and inclusivity and issues of gender have actually played out to provide us with the counter, what the counter narrative would have been, what the counterfactual would have been. And I want to just sort of go specifically to the model that is New Zealand. Obviously, no place is a utopia, but during what we saw during the period of time that we've just been going through is that leadership, particularly women in leadership, produce better outcomes when it came to the numbers of incidences of COVID in community and the number of deaths, and basically the ability for the country itself to absorb the shock of this this new novel disease. We also saw a country like New Zealand with a very high positive peace ranking, having again the systemic strength and capacity to now, you know, to essentially have been certainly relative to any metric in the U.S. and most other countries to have been relatively untouched by the pandemic. This is really remarkable and notable because it actually proves the thesis that is at least at the basis of our work at ICP, which is to say that when all of these core parts of our day-to-day are humming well, whatever those external shocks are much easier to absorb and to still thrive in that. And resilience is not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward in a way that allows for there to be, you know, possibilities that we hadn't imagined. I do want to underscore that the conversations that we'd had to think about, you know, the beginnings of what this is now ICP was really trying to sort of push back on these very vivid depictions of collapse, right? To push back on these vivid depictions of chaos and to really understand what are the core elements of maintaining strength and a peace as balance and harmony moving forward and in response to some of the unknowns that we'll be facing.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Kealoha, maybe I know we're coming up on time and we do have a question in the Q&A, but would you like to share anything about some local initiatives or policies that give you hope?
Yeah, and I think even related to COVID, I always think about the community in the island of Molokai. So if folks haven't seen it, they produced a video in Island in the Pandemic by Matt Yamashita. It's on Vimeo. Anyone can watch it. I can put the link into the chat. I think about 4 months before the pandemic, we held the Molokai Climate Resiliency Summit. And that was a really important opportunity for us to come together as community leaders, as elected officials, as residents of Homestead, of Kupuna and Keiki, and scientists and farmers and everyone coming together to think about what can you do in one place with the resources that are here. And I think about that now. And then if you watch the video and documentary An Island in the Pandemic, you see how fortuitous it was that we have such conversations and that we have an opportunity to take a day or a weekend to think about what are those resources that need to be in place, because we didn't know what 4 months later was going to hold. We don't know what a year later has in store for us. But I fundamentally think that having those conversations in a communal way was able to drive a tremendous response for the entire island of Molokai, and how they were incredibly efficient in coming together and protecting their people and protecting their health. And so I think about that a lot. My son loves the song All Hawaii Stand Together. Like, that's one of his favorite songs. He's been singing it all year. I mean, I think, one thing that I tremendously deeply miss, and maybe is part of my own grief for my COVID grief, my climate grief, is I do fundamentally miss when we're at those community meetings and those town halls and, just Kanikapila, where we come together and we know those same songs and we know about those same places, and that we have an emotional and spiritual attachment to ensuring that those places are not just here for right now, but they're here for many more generations to come. And so I just think of that, and I think of all the ways in which our neighborhoods and communities, big and small, are doing this work every single day, and it doesn't need to make the news, and it doesn't need to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's about the way that we live, and it's about the values that we act upon, our lavena and our behaviors that we carry with us each and every day.
Thank you so much, Kealoha. We do have a question from the audience. We have some questions, but I'm going to pick one and try to wrap it up into a concluding question for each of you to answer. So Sonia has written in and she asks, how might we address the climate crisis that exacerbates racism and other structural inequalities? So thinking of that, how might we as individuals, maybe if you can give a advice or one step for an attendee watching this right now to take away as an individual confronting the climate crisis, but being an active part of their community, but then recognizing just how pervasive that climate change is. Where can we as individuals start?
I'll just sort of say that this is a tough one, just because I usually spend an hour on this one question, right? And also, pardon me, I will say that, one of the key changes that we've seen over the last year, and this is perhaps one of the upsides of the pandemic in a strange way, is that we've been sort of forced to reflect on all things big and small. And I think that that's why we're seeing this really critical shift in the way we understand systemic racism, for example, and the way we understand sort of environmental degradation is sort of baked into some of the systemic choices that we've some of the choices that have ended up being sort of baked into structural elements of life. And so understanding that this is the context. There are scholars that have written in critical race theory, for example, describe racial hierarchy as sort of the weather, like we're constantly sort of moving through it. Similarly, climate is climate and the weather, in the sense that it's not just an issue that we're really trying to tackle and get at and it's sort of discrete, but it's the context within which all of our actions, our leadership, our best days, our worst days will take place in that space. And so sort of reframing it and understanding it as such will allow for us to be really sort of clear-eyed and when we're looking at the problems that we're facing, and also the potential solutions. Inclusivity is not going to be just a nice to have, it will be critical both to diagnose and to prescribe solutions for the problems that we're seeking in the context of, again, racial hierarchy and sort of the mother of all environmental assaults, which is our threats, which is the climate crisis. So that reorientation becomes important, as does understanding and seeing, having our eyes wide open and talking about it with our friends, family, and colleagues.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. So much to think about. So much to think about. Oof. Oh my goodness. It can, yeah, get a little overwhelming sometimes, but I just want to say mahalo, mahalo, mahalo for the work that you are doing. Really reframing how we look at the climate crisis, how we think about it, our roles in it. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing some of your wisdom with us today. Let me see. I know we're at time. So yeah, okay, just looking at the chats again, we have some people saying thank you so much.
Thank you for creating this space for us to be together, which lessens our grief. And thank you all in attendance and watching for doing your part and being contributors to positive peace and resilience. And we are grateful to have you as part of our community. Please do learn more about us and connect with us when you can.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Kealoha. Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, Palakiko. Please, everyone, stay safe and be well. Happy Earth Day again. I hope we can all turn away and think just how special and beloved this place is, how lucky we are to call this place home. Yeah, mahalo, mahalo, and aloha. Thank
Aloha.
you.
Aloha.